Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. And welcome to my basement, and welcome to the second semester. We start a new unit today, that of the Great Depression. In our last time that we met together, we were talking about the Roaring Twenties. Now, the Roaring Twenties were coming to an uneasy end. Today, we resume that story with Episode 1, Crash. So, dear students, incline your ears and hear our stories that you might know your place among his delights. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to summarize the critical problems threatening the American economy in the late 1920s. You should be able to describe the causes of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And you should be able to explain how the Great Depression affected the economy and the United States throughout the world. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. Here I want to talk about how industries, while they looked like they were doing great in the Roaring 20s, had some deep flaws that were pretty obvious now in retrospect. And it was that the industries were in serious trouble. The superficial prosperity of the 1920s was shrouded the weakness that would signal the onset of the Great Depression. Key basic industries like railroads and textiles and the steel production, they'd barely made a profit. Railroads were losing business to new forms of transportation like trucks and buses and private automobiles. Mining and lumbering, that's a great word, mining and lumbering, which had expanded during the wartime of World War I, were no longer in demand, and that correction was pretty rippling through the economy. One important economic indicator that was declining during this time was housing starts. The number of new homes, the new dwellings that were being built. And this is a thing that, economists look at today as a way of gauging the economy also, housing starts. Because when housing starts fall, so do jobs in a lot of related industries, not only just housing construction, but also furniture manufacturing and, cutting timber for lumber. Subpoint B, during World War I, farm prices were rising, and there was international demand for crops like wheat and corn. And that demand was just since soaring through American agricultural markets. Farmers were planting more and taking out loans for more land and more equipment. However, demand fell after the war, basically as Europe began to recover and was able to produce its own food. Plus, there wasn't the demands of feeding all the troops at one time. And so as the demand for agricultural products were decreasing, crop prices went down also, declined as much as 40%. Farmers, though, realizing that they weren't making as much money, did what's actually kind of a natural response and say, well, we're not making as much money as we used to. We need to go plant more crops because that way we'll be able to, harvest more food and be able to go sell it at market. And, we're not getting as much per, acre, but we'll just plant more acres to get more out of it. But that continues to have the same problem of going and flooding the market with more and more materials. So between 1919 and 1921, annual farm income was declining pretty sharply from $10 billion to just over $4 billion, a pretty catastrophic drop in the agricultural industry. Farmers who had gone into debt, had difficulty in going and paying off their loans. All of the loans they had got to buy new equipment and new farmland and all of that stuff has to be paid for somehow, and they're not making as much money as they used to on the crops. And a lot of farmers ended up losing their farms altogether when the banks foreclosed and seized the property as payment. As farmers began to default on their loans, a lot of rural banks also began to fail. Auctions were held to go recoup some of the bank's losses, and this was a pretty hard time in American agriculture. Subpoint C. Although a lot of Americans appeared to be prosperous during the 1920s, in fact, they were living well beyond their means, and they often bought goods on credit, an arrangement where consumers agreed to buy the good now and then go pay for it later or pay for it over time. It was often in terms of an installment plan that encouraged Americans to go buy and then repay it in little installments along the way, also incurring interest charges, meaning that the purchase was more expensive once interest was factored in over time. By making credit, though, easily available, a lot of businesses were encouraging Americans to buy new stuff, but to pile on new consumer debt also. A lot of people then had trouble paying off those debts when the hard times came. Faced with debt, consumers cut back on their spending, which, sent not agriculture, but industrial production in a further downward spiral, which means that the factories weren't getting as many jobs or getting as many orders, which means they didn't have to make as many jobs, and hours get cut and positions get cut, and people are harder off and they buy less and less stuff. And it's a vicious downward spiral. Subpoint D. During the 1920s, the rich certainly did get richer and the poor definitely got poorer. Between 1920 and 1929, the income of the wealthiest 1% of the population went up by 75%. A tremendous rise for the richest people, going up by 75% in the course of a decade, compared though with 9% increase for Americans as a whole. Now, a 9% increase is not nothing, and we don't need to underplay that, but we're really looking at a pretty radical strip tripping between the top and the middle and definitely in the bottom, subpoint D. We're still in subpoint D. More than 70% of the nation's families earned less than $2,500 a year. And considered $2,500 a year today wouldn't be very much, but it was considered kind of the minimum amount that a family could have a decent standard of living at. Americans earning twice as much of that, even people that earned twice as much as the minimum standard, had a hard time affording the products that manufacturers were otherwise putting into the market. Scarcely half of the homes in cities had electric lights or a furnace for heat. Only 1 home in 10 had an electric refrigerator, and we're not talking about like the 1800s here. We're talking about the 1920s, the crest of the 1930s, subpoint E. Although economic disaster was around the corner, the election of 1928 took place in a mood of what looked like apparent national prosperity. This election in 1928 pitted the Republican candidate Herbert Hoover against the Democrat named Alfred Smith. And in 1928, Hoover had been the Secretary of Commerce underneath Harding and Coolidge. And you'll remember that we've met Hoover before. He was the guy that engineered the European Relief Program and nearly fed a continent almost single-handedly. Herbert Hoover was considered kind of a genius at just about everything he did. He was a career politician. He was not a career politician. Herbert Hoover was a mining engineer. He'd made his money in the private sector and was a rags to riches, essentially a millionaire. Well respected. Everybody loved Herbert Hoover. He was facing off against Al Smith. Al Smith, a career politician. He'd served 4 terms as a governor of New York. Al Smith was personable and enjoyed being in the limelight. Hoover was totally the opposite. Hoover was, quiet and reserved and kind of a engineering nerd. He just kind of liked, he was reserved. He just wasn't like the big flashy Al Smith. Hoover had also a major advantage. He could point to years of prosperity under Republican administrations all the way back to 1920. A lot of Americans believed him when he said, "We are in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than we've ever been before." And it, in 1928, was an overwhelming victory for Herbert Hoover. Subpoint F. By 1929, some economists had warned of weaknesses in the economy, but most Americans maintained the utmost confidence in the nation's economic health. In increasing numbers, people who could afford so put all of their money as much as they could in the stock market. The stock market had been the most visible symbol of a prosperous American economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was the most widely used barometer of the stock market's health. It's actually still a measure that we use today to talk about how well the stock market is doing. We'll say, well, the Dow closed up 30 points today, which would be a big close. But whatever. The Dow closed up, the Dow closed down. It was a measure of the stock prices of the 30 most important companies trading on the New York Stock Exchange. And for most of the 1920s, stock prices were rising pretty steadily. The Dow had reached a high of 381 points, nearly 300 points higher than it had been just 5 years earlier. And eager to take advantage of this new bull market, they called it, Americans just put everything they could into stocks and bonds. By 1929, about 4 million Americans, roughly 3% of the nation's population, was owning stocks. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge number, just 3% owning stocks, but it's an important 3%. These investors were already wealthy, mostly, but they were hoping, most of the investors in 1929 were already wealthy, but others, just average Americans, were hoping to get into the stock market and go strike it rich as well. However, the seeds of trouble were beginning to take root. People were engaging in speculation. Speculation is sort of like financial gambling, buying stocks and bonds with the hopes of cornering a quick profit, and then while ignoring the risks along the way. Buying speculation sometimes means that people would go borrow money from a bank, like actual money from a bank, to go put it into, gambling money in the stock market to hope to recoup it later. But if it doesn't turn out, then you still have to owe the bank the money and you end up losing your investment twice. A lot of people began buying on margin. A margin was a particular type of buying where a small percentage of the stock's price was seen as a down payment to go borrow the rest. And that money basically made it easier for people to get into the stock market, but it also fueled reckless speculation and helped drive up the cost of stocks and drive up the stock market, but kind of an artificial driving it up. In reality, the rising prices weren't reflecting what an actual company was worth. And worse more, the value of the stocks began to decline. People who had bought on margin had no way to go pay off the loans because the whole scheme is predicated on continuing rising stock markets, subpoint 2. And that doesn't last forever. And in September of 1929, stock prices peaked and then briefly very fell in September of 1929. And confidence in the market began to waver. People said, oh, wait a minute, stocks can go down in price? And some investors quickly sold their stocks and pulled out altogether. That was in September of 1929. On October 24th of 1929, the market took a full-on plunge. Panicked investors unloaded their shares. Consumers, like just average people, began to max out their installment plans. And they ended up actually owning like 100% of their net worth to others. They had borrowed so much money that the money they had saved in the bank wouldn't have covered the debt that they had along the way. A key theory of this slowdown, like the early days of the Great Depression, was that average people and investors ended up causing the depression by taking on too much debt, which was an unsustainable future for the individual consumers, individual families. Subpoint B. Then on October 29th, a day known to us today as Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out of the market. Shareholders frantically tried to sell before the prices of the stocks plunged even lower. Basically, watching the stock markets fall, people said, I gotta get on the stock market, and we're selling, and that was just driving down prices, not unlike the way that panic had driven up prices in previous years. Additional millions of shares couldn't find buyers altogether at any price. And people who had bought stocks on credit were stuck with huge debts. The prices plummeted, and others lost all of their savings. An entire life worth of trying to accumulate everything spiraled down really quickly. By mid-November, investors had lost about $30 billion, an amount equal to how much America spent in all of World War I was lost in just a couple of months of the stock market. So point C. Now, a common economic belief was that during hard times, countries should protect their own industries by raising tariffs, saying, hey, if America is falling on hard times, then we need to go protect American industries. And we'll put tariffs on imports from other countries, and that will mean that Americans making stuff here in America, it'll look cheaper compared to what imports were. That's the idea of a tariff. A tariff is a tax, and a tariff does raise money because it is a tax, but it's not a tax in the way that the government's trying to go fund its own revenues. A tariff is really about trying to make imports look cheaper than domestically made stuff. So that way people are more likely to buy American and protect American industries. And that was a common economic belief, that that's the way that you should protect your own economy. It wasn't a universal belief, though, particularly among the growing field of economics and economists. Despite 1,000 economists telling the president not to do so, he signed a bill known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. You'll also see it listed as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. And despite its terrible name, Hoover passed it anyway. That effectively killed international trade. U.S. trade partners retaliated by putting on their own tariffs and limited U.S. exports. So basically what happened was that we put the Smoot-Hawley Tariff on to try to go protect American industries from other countries importing to the United States. But what always seems to happen with tariffs is once that a major tariff is put on, all the other countries said, wait a minute, America's putting a tariff on us, then we'll go put a tariff on Americans. And then suddenly we can't export to their countries as well. There's also other problems that it ends up driving up the prices of consumers altogether, and that's not good if you're trying to protect Americans. By July 8th of 1932, the stock market was down almost 90% from its high. After the Smoot-Hawley tariff, unemployment jumped and the stock market plunged again. By 1932, American unemployment had risen to 23.5%. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans couldn't find a job. It had been just 3% years before. People feared mass starvation and revolution. And this is the kind of stuff that gets people to go grab a pitchfork. Roman numeral number 3. The stock market collapse signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. The economy had plummeted and the unemployment was skyrocketing in that period from 1929 to 1940. Now, it wasn't the crash alone that caused the Great Depression, and this is an important piece that we need to understand. The stock market crash does not... it's not the Great Depression. However, we can say it's the signal of it. It's the beginning of the Great Depression. It did also hasten the collapse of the economy, and it made the Depression far more severe. Subpoint B. After the crash, people began to panic and withdraw money from the banks, but some people couldn't get their money altogether because the banks had invested their money into the stock market, and there was no money to get back. In 1929, 600 banks closed. By 1933, 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks failed. As a comparison, in 2019, the last time I looked up these numbers, there were 4 bank failures. The year before, in 2018, there were 0 bank failures. In 1929, there was 600. In 1933, there was 11,000. That's crazy. I mean, that's just catastrophe. Because the government didn't have any way to protect or insure banks, millions of people just lost all the money in their savings accounts. And when the bank went out of business, if you had money in the bank, you didn't get it anymore. That's not the way our modern banking system works today, and we'll get with how that exists, but it certainly is what happened there. If you've ever seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, that's really a movie about a bank failure. The Great Depression hit other businesses also. It wasn't just stock markets and banks. Between 1929 and 1932, the gross national product, which is a way that you measure how much business a country is doing, it's the nation's total output of goods and services, the GNP was cut nearly in half, from $104 billion to $59 billion. That's a pretty catastrophic cut. While approximately 90,000 businesses went bankrupt. And among these failed enterprises were once prosperous industries like the automotive industry and the railroads, and some of the biggest countries in America were suddenly bankrupt. As the economy was plunging into a tailspin, millions of workers just lost their jobs altogether. Unemployment went from 3% in 1929 to almost 25% by 1933, and 1 in 4 workers were out of a job. And those who kept their jobs, they were constantly facing the threats of pay cuts and reduced hours, and this was tough. Subpoint C. Europe was also not really in a great position here also. And this is worth remembering. While it is American history class, and while the Great Depression affects the United States pretty sharply, we weren't the only ones facing hard times. Europe had been suffering throughout the 1920s. European countries were trying to recover from all of the problems of World War I. Germany had those, huge reparations to pay, and Britain and France also had their own high war debts also. Germany's reparations, I think we could probably say, were pretty egregious. The reparations were these payments to go compensate the Allies for all of the damages that Germany had caused. And we remember that we had forced Germany to go sign the war guilt clause, meaning that they had to go take responsibility for all of World War I. And the Great Depression compounded all of these problems by limiting America's ability to go import European goods, and it made it difficult to sell American farm goods to overseas markets. And the Smooha Tariff made everything worse for both sides, including European markets as well. Subpoint D. Although historians and economists differ on what caused the Great Depression, most historians cite a set of common factors, and among them we might identify 4. There was a tariff and war debt policies that cut down on the foreign market for American goods. Essentially, we lost our most important trading partners. There was also a crisis in the farm sector. The way that we fed our nation was systematically broken. There was also the availability of easy credit. Easy credit looks pretty great for a while, but if it ends up, creating an unsustainable system for American families, that's not good. And then also a real unequal distribution of wealth. Some people were just fabulously rich, and most people weren't. That led to a demand for falling consumer goods. Even as newly mechanized factories were producing more and more products, the federal government contributed to the crisis by keeping interest rates low, and that allowed companies and individuals to go borrow more money and build up large debts along the way. And some of this borrowed money was used to go buy stocks later that led to the crash. At first, people found it hard to believe that the economic disaster had even struck at all. In November of 1929, Hoover is still a young president then, he's a year into his term. President Hoover was encouraging Americans to remain confident about the economy, believing that we could pull through it. That question of what is the confidence level that America should have in the face of the worst economic crisis they were ever seeing, well, it's a fabulous story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.